I had it in my mind that, oh, I already failed it the first time. I should pass.
It really highlights that, psychology is everywhere, especially in esports.
So I was very happy. But I think that's the lasting impression that it had on me. That, wow, this can be helpful,
You made me want to do psychology now. Honestly, no, Welcome to London Legion Login. I'm your host, Louis Skilton, and I am blessed today with introducing to you Kelvin Ing, who is a performance psychologist. And if, without further ado, would you mind introducing yourself?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show. My name is Kelvin. I am a psychologist who works within esports. A team I've worked with is JLingz Esports, but I also work within traditional sports. So currently I'm working with British Biathlon mainly. So if you don't know what biathlon is, and I think a lot of people don't know, it is basically skiing combined with rifle shooting. So it is a bit niche.
Which is mad, by the way. I've never, it sounds like a great concept. You're skiing down the Alps or something. Have you ever done it yourself?
I have not had the pleasure, unfortunately. But I used to shoot rifles and I used to ski, and I thought, oh, you know what, I can work with biathlon.
Nice.
That would be interesting for me to work with. So that's kind of the way I got into it, I suppose.
Gotcha.
But I've worked in a bunch of other sports as well, but biathlon is the main thing I'm doing at the moment.
Yeah, and you've also, again, as you said, entered the esports industry with JLingz,
Yes.
who have played, competed within the Halo Leagues, ALGS, which is Apex Legends, for those who don't know, and several other titles. How has that been? What are your impressions of the esports industry?
I think there's a lot of overlap between esports and traditional sports. But I guess my impression is that compared to maybe traditional sports, if anything, it seems like psychology is maybe even more important, because it's, there's not a lot of physical stuff. A lot of it is mental. A lot of it is in terms of kind of the decision making, reaction time, and I feel like a lot of it is very psychological. So if anything, I would feel like psychology is even more important. And I also feel that in esports, because it's such a new thing, the pressures that the esports player face is slightly different from athletes in a more established sport. There's more uncertainty, and there's more things going on that or maybe other people will have some preconceptions about esports players, so they have to contend with that. So there's other things that they have to deal with that maybe is not as common in traditional sports. And I feel like the type of people you get in esports, the type of experiences that the people have had in terms of who they are as esports players, they tend to be quite different from maybe the sort of people you get in the traditional sports world. So there's a degree of kind of personality or life experience different there as well, I feel.
So it's a very different attitude you have to put towards esports. But one thing that I found very interesting that you mentioned in the talk at College of Esports earlier is that, the attitude towards performance coaches is very different than in other fields. And could you just kind of address what those problems are? What is a performance psychologist in esports?
So I think is not necessarily that different in traditional sports. Maybe it's a little bit more prevalent in esports. Maybe because psychology is, in my opinion anyways, a little bit more important. It's even a bigger factor.
Yeah, what I mean is, what is the perception of it?
Oh, okay, I see, yeah.
Yeah.
So even with the perception, there are some similarities there. I think a lot of organizations or players are not necessarily fully aware of the benefits that a psychologist can bring to their team. They might be thinking, why would I even need a psychologist? A common, I guess, myth is that, I'm fine. I'm not, having mental difficulties. I'm not mentally unwell, why would I speak to a psychologist? And is I guess that awareness of what a sport and exercise psychologist can do, but on the other hand, on the other, I guess, edge of the sword, there's also what a sports psychologist or psychologist in general cannot do.
Yeah.
Because I know, sometimes there are expectations, right? That some people, they think, oh, sports psychologist, that's really going to turn everything around. That's going to be, if I hire them, they're going to make my team a million times better. It's going to turn everything around in no time. And it's having that realistic expectation that actually most of the time, psychological work is going to take a lot of effort, a lot of time. It's not the kind of thing where you can just hire someone in and they can change everything for you really fast. And if a practitioner suggests that they're able to do that, then I would contend that be a little bit cautious. I'm not sure if that's a realistic expectation that they're setting for you there, and that can actually damage the confidence that the industry have on practitioners in general.
So let's start with Kelvin.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get into psychology? What was the stem of it?
That is actually a very interesting story. Maybe not to you, but
yeah.
So my first degree is actually not in psychology.
Right.
It was actually in history.
Right.
And that's just because that's something I've always interested in. I've always done well in school at it. So, my first degree is history. But kind of during university and after, so I may have mentioned before that my background was in snow sports. So I did a lot of instructing, a few seasons of instructing as a snowboard and ski instructor. So I was working in that snow sports industry. I worked in one of the FIS World Cup events. And I was talking to one of the coaches from the New Zealand men's team. And what he told me that really stuck with me at that point was that he was very big into sports psychology. And he told me that it was very important for his guys, for his lads, to be at that peak mental performance. And he really stressed that it doesn't happen that often for his athletes. Throughout the year, maybe there's only a couple of times where they're really at that peak mental state, and it's really important to prepare them. Anyways, we talked a bit about psychology and stuff, and that's when I thought, oh, that is really interesting. I really want to go into that. And another thing that got me really interested in it personally is that when I was an instructor, to become an instructor, you have to pass these exams, right? And they're quite technical. You have to get certain things just right. You have to perform to a high performance, high standard. You have to get a lot of performance out of your skis and stuff. And, at that time, that's a lot of pressure for me. That has a lot of implications, right? If I pass the exams, then that's more pay, that's higher qualification, you get a lot out of it. So I felt a lot of pressure, and I had quite a lot of, I guess, performance anxiety on some of the more technical stuff. And what I experienced was that when I was anxious, when I was nervous, my whole body was locking up, right? I have thoughts in my head like, oh, I really need to do good at this. I really need to do well. I really need to pass. I've done all the training, I've paid all the fees, I really need to do well. And it was just all getting to me a little bit. And my body was locking up and I couldn't do the movements. So, there are different levels of instructors, right? And when I was going for my kind of level 2, I actually had to try it 3 times before I passed.
Oh, wow.
So the first time I was kind of, maybe I wasn't quite good enough. I was kind of good enough, so it was 50-50 whether I passed it or not.
Okay.
But the first few days didn't go well, and then I was really nervous, and then it didn't go well for me. And I think that stayed with me the second time I attempted it the next season as well, that I had it in my mind that, oh, I already failed it the first time. I should pass. And throughout the week of the exam, I was actually skiing quite well. My examiner was like, oh, you're doing really well. I bet you'll pass. You're doing really good. But on the actual day where they assess everything, that was the day it got to me.
Oh, no.
And my muscles was locking up. I couldn't get the performance out of my skis. I could feel my heart beating. It was my whole body was locking up, very tense.
I know exactly what
Um,
you mean.
and then I couldn't do those movements at all. It was a complete mess. So at the end of the day, my examiner was saying that she was very sorry that I didn't pass, and she was like, "What is going on? You're doing so well throughout the week. You could do everything so good. What happened on the last day?" And then that was a moment of introspection for me, where I was really gutted, really disappointed. But I was thinking, is there something that I can do that can help me get over this? So the next season, when I tried it again, I started looking a little bit more into sports psychology, and I read up on stuff online, which is, well, information online is not always the most reliable.
Yeah,
But I looked some stuff up, tried some stuff out for myself. Some breathing techniques, some grounding techniques, and I was still nervous on the day. And so we get 2 tries to do certain technical things. And the first try was really bad. And I thought, okay, let me use some of these techniques. Let me do some breathing. Let me do some grounding. And that really helped me. And the second time, for the second chance, I wouldn't say it's my best performance ever, but I managed to kind of calm myself down to get to a level where I could actually do the movements quite well. So that third time, I finally passed. I was very happy. But I think that's the lasting impression that it had on me, that, wow, this can be helpful, for people. So that's kind of when I got into it. That's how I got interested into psychology, and then I went on to do my master's in psychology of mental health, and then I specialized in sport and exercise psychology, where I've completed my stage 1 training.
You made me want to do psychology now. Honestly, no, just genuinely, I've got an experience of my own there.
Yeah.
Like, funny enough, it was Student Champs, which is a esports event in the UK. I had a year where my team just went flawless, and it was great. It was like, we were on a permanent honeymoon phase, all to the point where, we get invited to a LAN. And it's the flashing lights. It's the, if I don't win this, that year is for nothing. There's so many motivators and so many like stressors that, when even after the portfolio, the wins, like the confidence, it's just, as you found it, it was just a bit much. And like, you were still capable of doing it, I was still capable of doing it, but in the end, I was just a bit too de-stressed. And yeah, I think it really highlights that, psychology is everywhere, especially in esports, especially, in competitive environments. And maybe if I just had 1 or 2 of those breathing techniques, I wouldn't have, done as poorly. But yeah, it's very, I just relate to it a lot. And, like, let's talk about how you've specialized as well, because not every psychologist is the same. Especially in esports, we can see that, performance coach can mean so many different things, right? Where do you specialize?
So I think in the esports space, you see a lot of psychology practitioners, professionals, and they all use kind of maybe differing titles. So you mentioned performance coach, and that's one I see quite a lot as well. But there's others. It's maybe mental coach, mental skills trainer, or all kinds of titles that they use. And I know it can be confusing. So it's kind of understanding what do these different titles mean, and what does that how does that qualify them to do what they do. So I would say, in terms of performance coach or maybe even mental coach, what they should be doing, I guess, but what that maybe qualifies to them to do, or what that title describes rather, is more like a coach. Not necessarily a psychologist, maybe a psychology professional, something that works within that field, within the mental space. But I wouldn't say they necessarily, I guess, are qualified to provide safe, ethical, psychological support. They could be very good at training people in certain skills, like the breathing or mindfulness or something like that. But that's not quite the same as providing safe and ethical psychological support. And for that, to support the athletes in that way, what you would really want is to hire somebody who's qualified as a psychologist. So there are protected titles out there that kind of guarantees a certain standard of training and of practice. So you might want to look at whether a practitioner uses or is eligible to use a title like a sport and exercise psychologist. So that's a title that's protected in the UK anyways. And this does differ from country to country and jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Right.
The UK is protected by the British Psychological Society and the Health and Care Profession Council. So the only people who have undergone accredited training by those organizations can use that title. And it's the same for counseling psychologists, clinical psychologists, or even chartered psychologist or registered psychologist. So these are all protected titles.
And one thing you noted as well is that, or I noticed, is that cognitive behavioral therapy may overlap with a lot of the professions. Yet one thing, like quote unquote, is that you said, which I think is really useful, is it's not about the tools, it's about the knowledge of the practitioner, right? So it's, how you're applying them, how you're undergoing, and who you're treating is quite important, would you say?
Yeah, I think what I was getting at there is that maybe it's not necessarily the tools or techniques that a psychologist use.
Yeah.
But it is maybe it's not so much knowledge as the relationship. It's that therapeutic relationship between the psychologist and the client, and being able to build that relationship is maybe something that maybe a performance coach might not necessarily be trained in providing. So I would say it's more in that area that the research shows that maybe the most important factor in determining kind of outcome in therapeutic work is not the modalities that the psychologists use.
Right.
It's not whether it's CBT or psychodynamic or whatever. It is that relationship that is the best predictor, maybe the most important predictor in the therapeutic outcome. So that is massive, very important part of psychological work. But it's not necessarily the most important maybe for a performance coach.
Yeah.
So I see a lot of, and the thing, I think the confusion in this space is that some orgs or managers, they might look at it and say, oh, it's all psychology, it's all the same. But it's not necessarily the same. So they might be like, oh yeah, we don't need a psychologist. We already got this guy who's a performance coach or whatever.
Right.
But that's not necessarily the same thing, I think. And performance coach is a very vague and confusing title. It could refer to maybe more technical stuff as well as psychology stuff, right?
Right.
So it's not necessarily so clear cut in terms of the titles people use. But what sometimes you see in the industry is that people who do have protected titles, people who are sport and exercise psychologists or chartered psychologists, they use a title like performance psychologist or performance coach when they're in the esports space because people understand what that is.
Right.
I think one very common thing that I get when I tell people that I do sport and exercise psychology, what they tell me is that, oh, is that like massage? Is that like massaging people? And I'm like, it's not quite. But if I tell people, oh, I'm a performance psychologist, that they don't really have the same kind of. So it's about marketing.
Yeah.
So people could have very good qualifications, but they use these titles to just to market themselves so that they can present themselves in a way that people relate to. And so yeah, when you're looking at people who use these titles, it's important as well just to dig a little bit deeper to do that due diligence.
Saying you're a performance coach, does that not add to the confusion sometimes? Or is it just that, like, again, the stigma of esports is they want a performance coach. Maybe some organizations look to only have one coach per se because that's within their budget, within their means.
Yeah.
Is that just kind of like a fault of esports just being like, okay, well, we've got to cram everything into this one role?
I wouldn't say it's just esports,
Yeah.
You do see it in other sports as well. And I think it's largely that maybe come from a place where, like you said there, where maybe it's limited, constrained by resources,
Yeah.
but maybe also from a place where there's not a lot of understanding and knowledge around what is the difference, what is a performance coach, what is a psychologist, what is the difference there? Why can't one person just do it all? So a part of it comes from that maybe lack of knowledge, lack of understanding. So it's not just, I guess, endemic to esports. It is something that's quite common, and I suppose in an ideal world, right? You can tell people, "Oh, I'm a sport and exercise psychologist."
Yeah.
And then they will know exactly what you're talking about. They know exactly what you do. But we don't live
Gotcha.
in that ideal world, unfortunately, where a lot of people, they will say, "Are you like a masseuse then?" So it is about educating the public is one way to do it, but we're not in that space yet now where you can say that. So I think there's it's understandable why a lot of practitioners maybe want to style or market themselves as a performance coach or a performance psychologist.
So let's clarify, how does your role, how is it different to a performance coach? What are the added extras and maybe things that aren't included in what you would offer?
Well, I think that is a difficult question to answer because it depends on how you define a performance coach.
Right.
As we've just discussed,
Yeah.
it's such a vague title that you can have.
So true, actually.
You can
Yeah.
have someone who maybe specializes in a certain thing in the game, even a game-specific thing, and they can call themselves a performance coach. Oh, I specialize in certain things in a certain game, and they call themselves performance coach. Or even normal coaches call themselves performance coach because technically they are working with performance. So it depends, But I would say is what's something that psychologists can do, especially some psychologists with like a protected title that can offer. That's maybe somebody using an unprotected title like performance coach, where it's not guaranteed for them.
Right.
It's that level, that standard of training. So if somebody uses a protected title, you know that they have a certain degree of training, a certain level, a certain standard of training to be able to provide a safe, ethical practice. And that's not strictly true for somebody using an unprotected title. But that's by no means, the only way to judge how good someone is, of course.
Yeah.
Ideally, everybody who is in this space would have some sort of qualification, but unfortunately, that's not the case.
So say someone does want to, like, someone is very qualified to, or a good, passionate person that wants to provide one-to-one mentorship, etc., but they don't have those, have the training that an organization would actually want to be looking for. What are some of the risks there that run if there isn't any of that, ethical, what happens when the ethics are breached?
So the main thing, I think, if there's a breach of ethics, is that it could potentially cause harm to the client.
Right.
If somebody is not trained to provide safe, ethical, psychological support, but that's how they market themselves. That's what they say they can do.
Right.
That's potentially could be damaging for the players. It could cause them psychological damage. It could lead to a bad image of the profession in general. That I worked with like a psychology professional before, and it was utterly terrible, and I'm never going to work with one again.
Yeah.
So there's that risk to the reputation of professionals. But there's also a risk of real harm, coming to the players, or in best case scenario where it's completely inefficient and a waste of time. But I guess the thing to be aware is that even if, I'm not saying that everyone who has a protected title is an amazing psychologist, and I'm not saying that people who don't have one have no idea what they're doing.
Right.
I'm saying that it provides a degree of guarantee. Nothing is 100% in life, right?
It's a safety net.
It provides a degree of assurance that this person has received this training, that is accredited, and they can provide psychological support in a safe, ethical way, and that is what you might not necessarily get. They could be practicing very safely and ethically, but there's not that same assurance if the practitioner does not have a protected title.
Gotcha. So what can, from your experience, working like within the esports industry, like having a bit of a dabble, what would you like to see in terms of support for psychologists maybe going forward? Are there any things that you think could be improved with how the industry approaches it at the moment? Maybe perceptions? Like, I think that's just quite interesting to hear your insight from.
I think, just maybe a more understanding,
Yeah.
more knowledge about how psychologists in your team can work.
Yeah.
And I know there are some people in this space who have a really good reputation, right? Everybody knows about them. They're amazing. But if, they don't necessarily, there's a difference between having that reputation and actually being the best psychologist they can be.
Right.
And I think having a little bit more awareness about, how you can choose a good psychologist would be very beneficial to the space. Just having maybe more knowledge at the management level about what does a sport and exercise psychologist do? What does a psychologist do? How can they help? How can we know they're good at what they do? And just having that knowledge would be helpful. Rather than kind of, having those questions like, oh, is that like the same as a massage, or kind of what is a sports psychologist, how can they help me? That's sport. Esports, that's different. Or things like, oh, none of my players are mentally ill, so we don't need you. So kind of maybe just having that more of that understanding, maybe having a realistic expectations of what can be achieved. I wouldn't say this is something specific to esports. It's something that is applicable to other sports as well, but maybe esports being newer, maybe it's a little bit more prominent in that sense.
Yeah, great. And one thing I noticed is that the way you put yourself forward, you have your own vision in how you like to address and deal with clients, and you, I think, I may be wrong, but you focus on performance and growth, like the well-being side as well. Is that something that can be different based on different sport and exercise psychologists?
Yeah, so different practitioners, whether they're sport and exercise psychologists, other psychologists, or even performance coach, everyone has their own way of working.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't necessarily say that one way of working is better than another.
Yeah.
But they will focus on slightly different thing. So me, from a more humanistic perspective, I focus on helping my clients grow and develop, and the performance and the well-being. That's kind of a result of that. That's kind of the byproduct of that almost. But my focus is on supporting the players to grow and to develop. And different psychologists might focus on different things. They might focus on similar things, but that would vary from practitioner to practitioner.
And what do you try to avoid that organizations may have come to you before in the past? Sport, esport. Are there things like, for example, let's say an organization wanted you to have an insight on a new roster. Like, where do you think your profession is restricted?
Again, I think that depends on the practitioner,
Yeah.
what they're comfortable with doing, what is their orientation, what fits with them and their approach as a practitioner.
Yeah.
But for me personally and professionally, I don't think that I would feel comfortable. I wouldn't want to be in a role where maybe I have a big, selective or evaluative role in that process. So like you said there, oh, why don't you have a look at this new roster, see who's the best, something like that.
Yeah.
Or maybe not quite that bluntly, but they might say, oh, I would like to hear your opinion on certain people before I hire them. And I think there's a few problems with that. The first is that it's really difficult to gauge, the potential for growth You might have two players, one who's maybe less emotionally or mentally developed than the other, but maybe they have a bigger potential for growth. And that's not something you can tell really, especially not in kind of, a quick meeting, a quick 1 hour session. It's not really something you can gauge from that. So in terms of the risks, I feel like that's, there's no empirical evidence to support that, to find out. There's no empirical way to find out who has the most potential for growth. So that's the first issue that I have with that. And the second issue I have with it is that if a psychologist is involved in that decision-making process, in that evaluative, selective process, then when those players do enter the team, they're going to look at that psychologist differently. They're going to be careful about what they say to that psychologist.
Yeah.
And that is going to be very harmful to what I talked about before, about that therapeutic relationship. And research shows that it is one of the most important elements in terms of psychological work and the outcome of it. So if a player don't feel like they can open up to you, if they don't feel like they can trust you, if they feel like they have to hold back, I'm not saying that's going to completely ruin all work you do with them, but that's definitely going to add to that barrier. That's definitely going to make it more difficult for you to be effective in helping them make psychological change.
Like a seed has been planted, it's in the back of their heads when they have the meetings. Yeah, that does seem like a bit of a barrier. And another thing to add is, rosters, especially in esports, they change all the time. Yeah. Sometimes by splits, sometimes by season. They are very volatile. As your results don't happen overnight. And how does that affect your work? Is there almost a tension in, like speed and quality? What is the impact?
I would say that it sounds like, a big thing, right?
Yeah.
A whole new team that you work with every split, every season.
Yeah.
But in terms of psychological working, I would say it's not that different from working in other sports or with other clients. And it's something that should be kind of, that I personally usually make sure in my contracting with my clients. So what that means is that when I first starting working with clients, I would establish kind of, those boundaries that, okay, what would you like to work on? Should we agree to work for a specific amount of time? Maybe I can provide you with support until the let's say the end of the season, and we'll have monthly check-in, and we can have different frequency of sessions. If you feel like there's something you want to work on, we can work on it more frequently. If you don't feel like it, we can just check in every month or so and see how you're doing. Or if the resources are more tight, more limited, another possibility that you see quite a lot, especially in the more clinical settings, where the NHS, they don't have unlimited resources to spend on people, right?
Yeah.
So it's particularly in those settings, you see psychologists contracting that, okay, we're going to have these 8 sessions, and we're going to see what we can do in those 8 sessions.
Right.
I wouldn't say, it doesn't affect it in that you have to rush anything. I think that would be harmful to the process. If you don't, if towards the end you don't solve everything, that's just a fact of life. That's just what happens when you don't have enough resources. But at least you're handling what you can in a responsible, safe way.
So it's very important for you to make sure, no matter how much time, no matter, what amount of resources you're given, you have to follow it in its natural course. Is that kind of...
Yeah. I wouldn't say you would want to rush anything just because... it's getting to the end of the season and I've got so much to work on with this client still. It's about following the client and following at their own pace. It's not about rushing things. And if you don't finish everything by the end of the season, that is a shame, but it is what it is. And, in my own experience, right, I've worked with, in both cases where I've worked with clients with prolonged, continued support, where I kind of support them throughout the whole season, and we have loads of time to work stuff out, and that's great.
Right.
But I've also worked in kind of situations where, I want to do a lot before this before the season ends or before this competition. Or we're preparing for this competition. We only have 1 month. Let's do everything. And what I suggested and the resources was able to do for those examples that I had in mind was that I was able to kind of ramp up the frequency. So instead of maybe having just weekly sessions, I would have 2 sessions every week or even more. So it's about kind of being able to amp up those hours if there's a time constraint.
Yeah.
So we're still kind of spending a lot of time, but it's not rushed. It's not rushing it. It's about spending more time on it. And I also have situations where, resources are a little bit more limited and kind of have to say to clients, okay, this is our 8 sessions. And towards the end, we'll reassess. We'll see if there's availability. We'll see where we're at. And if at the end we don't get to work on everything we wanted to, then we'll just have to see if the situation changes, or if I don't get to work with them again, then that would be that. But at least I am following things through at their own natural pace. I'm not rushing anything.
So have you ever had like clients within esports that, maybe a bit rushed, or like, I think a really good one to know is, players spend a lot of time gaming. Sometimes it can range from, at least like 8 hours, 10 hours, 16 hours even sometimes in really dangerous circumstances. Where do you, there's not going to be a time in the day for that player where they're not going to be thinking about a game, or they're not going to have a sort of emotional reaction to, like recent performance. Is that quite difficult to navigate?
Well, the first thing I would say there is in my opinion, I don't think it's healthy for players to be playing
definitely.
that long.
I know, but...
So, that would definitely be, the first thing we work with.
Okay.
Even for traditional athletes, you're not going to find it, or even if you find people who are training that many hours, that's not going to be sustainable in the long term. And that's what we'll be working with. So if I do find a client like that, the first thing we're going to look at is, how can they get some rest? How can they make the way that they train, the way that they play, more sustainable for them?
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. But how would you navigate in the workplace? You're not meant to interfere with the coach's training plans, the game coaching, etc. Yeah, you've clearly identified that sometimes the coaching plans, the training sessions are too long. Like, especially in esports, that could be 8 hours, like 10 hours, etc. How would you begin this process with a coach?
Well, my role as a psychologist, as a team psychologist, is not really to tell them what to do.
Yeah.
I can provide information. I can provide research. I can say, oh, this is what the research shows. This is what, this shows suggests that it's really unhealthy to be doing that kind of thing. So that's what I can say to them. And I can support them in one-to-one sessions, provide that environment for them to help resolve their own problems. But it's not my job to tell them that this is not healthy. You should not be doing this. You should be changing the schedule. You should be doing this and this and this. My job is just to support the athletes at this point. In your scenario that you're saying, is to support them emotionally, support them psychologically, and to provide information, whether it's from research or anything else. So it's to provide that information, that empirical, evidence-based information from the research. It's to provide that psychological support. So in that case, that's all I can do.
Isn't that frustrating though? You're working with the clients, the players who you've said are your priority, right? And then you have a coach and he's like, all right, we'll throw another 2 hours in today. Just because like it's in esports, it is like generally perceived as a crunch, like a lot of hours put in, maybe minimal returns come out of the coaching sessions, but like it's just because, you don't get tired from esports as much as running around with the ball, right? So the availability to play is right in front of you. Is that not frustrating? Do you not is there no way you can push other than just showing the facts and the evidence?
Well, as a psychologist, you can't be that involved in that process.
Right.
If you are that emotionally involved with all your clients, like, it's going to be very draining for you. And that's the same, whether you're a sport and exercise psychologist or a counseling psychologist, a clinical psychologist, you have to maintain that distance. And that doesn't mean you can't empathize with them. That doesn't mean you can't understand how they feel. It's about kind of, understanding how they feel, putting yourself in the shoe, but not getting lost in their world.
Yeah.
And that's, you know what your job is. You know what your boundaries are. You know that it's not your job to control everything, to tell them how the schedule should be. You can work with the coach. You can support the coach. Maybe then they'll realize that, oh, actually, this might not be the best thing. Or, oh, actually, I'm only pushing these guys so hard because of some of their own reactions, their own emotions, their own behaviors. And you can tell them what the evidence is. And if they don't take that on board, if nothing changes, then, that's essentially not really something I can do anything about. That's not really my job. My job is just to support them. But, the clients, they have a responsibility for making changes for themselves. It's not my job to tell them what to do and to fix things for everyone. So that's what I would say to that. But I haven't really seen anything in esports where it's kind of at that level.
Right.
But I used to do some work in the poker world. And what I see in poker is that a lot of people play online, right? And I'd hear things like, oh, I've been grinding on it for 10 hours, ridiculous amount of hours.
Same as esports then,
so yeah, it's a similar thing. I think there's a lot of overlap, particularly between kind of poker and esports.
Yeah.
And that's something that I did hear from poker, is that, oh, I've been grinding all this, I've been grinding all that. And, it's not my job to tell them, oh, don't do it, don't do that. It's to say, oh, just to inform them about things like burnout, to inform them about, oh, about self-care. And of course, it's their responsibility for that change in their own lives.
Yeah, that's very interesting. But personally, I would, it's almost, it's trying to maintain the friendliness without actually being friends, I guess, that must be so difficult.
It's, you're providing a way of being, a way of working.
Yeah.
And you can't get lost in their world. You can't take responsibility that is not your own.
Yeah. I've moving on just a little bit. When it comes to esports and even like poker and other sports, especially with decathlon, I've forgotten the name of it. I'm sorry. Biathlon. I was gonna say decathlon. You mentioned earlier in the talk that there's a balance in not only the relationship you have with the players, but the relationship you have with the sport. Can you just elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, so I think what I was getting at that point was that somebody asked, is it better to know about that sport, would it be a barrier if in order to connecting with athletes, if you don't have idea what they're talking about, if you don't know anything about the sports? And I was saying that it is a bit of a double-edged sword, that there are pros and cons to both being very familiar with the sport and and knowing absolutely nothing about it. So I guess the risk, if you are very familiar with the sport, whether it's esports or traditional sports, is that sometimes if you're not careful, you might make assumptions. You might hear certain things and make certain assumptions about it. You might make assumptions about what the athlete is doing and what they're thinking, what they're feeling. And you might not necessarily take the time to understand them fully, to go into it and explore it with them. You might just kind of, oh yeah, I know what that is, and I had to go over it. Whereas it could be more beneficial to go a little bit deeper. And for practitioners who are maybe not familiar with the sports of the client, they usually take the time to understand what's going on, and to discuss that with the client. And that, a lot of clients, they genuinely love this sport. They love sharing it and talking about it to new people. And that's a very good way to build up that therapeutic relationship, to connect with them on that deeper level, to have that connect with them. that is maybe a risk of being overlooked if the practitioner is very familiar with the sport. But on the other hand, if a practitioner has no idea what's going on in the sport and maybe they don't handle it in the right way, then I suppose that could potentially be a barrier, or it could slow things down when you have to ask all the time, oh, what is this? Oh, what is that? So it could potentially slow things down, but that time, in my opinion, that is taken to understand the sport, that is not wasted. That is time you're spending on building that therapeutic relationship with your client, which, as I mentioned before, and I will stress again, is probably one of the most important aspects of psychological work.
Does it also, when someone explains something to you, does it also give insight on their personality as well? Has that ever been... have you ever noticed, just out of curiosity, the way someone said something has given you an insight into why they may or may not, in resolving an issue?
Well, what you've described there is basically therapy.
Yeah, I guess.
Work.
Yeah.
So, it's about, picking things up and exploring them. And a large part, that is possible with discussing anything. That is the whole point of, talking about them, talking about things, and particularly for sport and exercise psychology, where a lot of it is focused on performance, it's focused on the sport.
Right.
Then, talking about their sport, why they're in it, how they go about it. That's the work. That's the process.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And on top of that, there's also the other side as a player. If I was to do that, I know, for example, one of the coaching styles is to coach by teaching. And so it just has an extra cherry on top, I guess. It's the dynamic of, teaching your own, psychologist how to play the game is another form of, coaching and learning how to do it as well. That's quite an interesting thing to add. But, you don't, you haven't just been looking at the counseling side, but you've also done research into psychedelics as well. So can we start to move on to the mushrooms?
Yeah. It seems like you're quite interested in mushrooms.
No, it's
and
just
a lot of people are. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's a very big emerging field of research at the moment, and that's kind of what drawn me to it in the first place. So I'm currently doing my doctorate, and a lot of my doctoral research is around substance use in athletes, particularly in psychedelics. So in terms of the substance use literature, the scientific literature for athletes, there's a lot of stuff out there about maybe caffeine, about alcohol, about nicotine, about all sorts of things. And about doping, there's a large amount of literature about doping.
Yeah.
But what you don't really see a lot of is about psychedelics.
Yeah.
And, psychedelics is experiencing a sort of renaissance at the moment. You see a lot of legalization efforts. You see a lot of serious research that is actually looking into it that you haven't seen since, the war on drugs. You haven't seen since the 70s when everything was banned. And
right.
Everyone is looking into it. But not a lot of people is looking into how athletes use it.
Yeah.
Whether they're abusing it, whether it helps them. And that's kind of why I'm interested in that. And you see a lot of news reports, right? A lot of news stories, especially these days, where they're like, oh, this executive took psychedelics and that's where he is today.
Yeah.
Like Steve Jobs, you hear about Steve Jobs. Oh, I just, trip on acid in my parents' garage or whatever. So, and that's how I came up with the Apple computer.
Right.
And you hear all these kind of stories. You hear about, I don't know if you've heard about this baseball player, Doc Ellis, who...
I don't know. Would you mind...
so I think this was back in the 70s.
Okay.
And supposedly, he did acid, LSD.
Yeah.
I think on the plane or the day before he was supposed to do a game, and he hit what is called he threw what is called a no-hitter. I think he did. I'm not a baseball person.
Yeah.
But he did something good.
Right.
So I think it's a picture. He threw one, and it was kind of like the best throw of his entire career or something like that.
Right. Okay.
And a lot of people cite that, say, "Oh, look at that." But even within some of the I guess grey literature is what we would call it, but it is kind of the newspapers, reports like that. You see a lot of people reporting that, especially in extreme sports where there was heavy psychedelic subculture to begin with, that, you think about those skaters in the skating park, you think about those snowboarders, and all those kind of guys, where there's already, or surfing is another big one.
Yeah, I get that.
So there's already an existing that subculture of psychedelics, and a lot of them are saying, oh, you know what, it really helps me with my sport, but the fact is there is very limited scientific empirical evidence to say that it is safe or that it is beneficial to do that, and that's where I'm hoping to kind of explore more about and have some more empirical evidence about. Is this actually safe? What are the risks? What are the risks of abuse? What are the risks of addiction? What are the risks of any negative impact? But also look at, okay, all these people are reporting these benefits. What are the benefits? Is it creativity? Is it team cohesion, connectiveness to other people? Is it all these other kind of benefits, or flow state? A lot of athletes say, oh, I can really feel my body. I'm more aware of my body. So a lot of people reporting a lot of different evidence. And what I'm looking into is, what are these different things, these different benefits and drawbacks that people have reported? And, the future research would be looking into, okay, what is going on there?
Because from a broad topic, like one of the, foundations, organizations that are trying to, make a concrete, ethical regulated body for esports, one of them is the, Casper in Korea, for example. They have their own governing body, like British Esports. They are starting to emerge in that sector as well. Is that, Adderall is most commonly associated with cheating, and which may, or whoever decides, sometimes it's a medical appliance that some people need to actually function, and sometimes it's considered cheating. But where I'm curious about, the mushrooms is, if this is said to improve performance, if it is said to have these benefits, will that end up coming under, the line with, or the firing line of Adderall as well? And should that be the case, in your opinion?
Well, that's not really up to me.
Yeah, but you've researched, you're starting to, whilst you haven't formed any concrete results and conclusions yet, based on the current journey you have with it, are performance enhancing drugs like these essential for players within esports to be incorporating them, for a better quality of performance and well-being? Or is this something that should start to be banned and governed a lot more heavily?
Well, again, I don't think there's any evidence for either one. So this study I did is kind of the first to kind of even look into this. So there's no evidence to suggest either way, and I'm not, just kind of disclaimer, I'm not suggesting anybody take any illegal substances in their jurisdiction. Okay. But what I'm saying is that there should be more research into it, because a lot of people are saying, oh, I'm doing this for this reason. I'm doing this to enhance my performance. I'm doing this because it helps me be better at work, because it helps me cope with being the pressures of an executive, or it helps me to do my sport better. And I'm not the only one who's seeing this in the newspaper. You get other athletes, other executives, other people in the world who are seeing this, and they're like, oh, I wonder if that's true. I wonder if I should do it myself. And they don't have any empirical evidence to help them make that decision. They don't have any empirical evidence, that would help them in terms of managing that risk, in terms of helping them make that decision. So what I'm saying is we need to investigate this into more, so that if it's harmful, if it's bad, then we have evidence for that. Or if it is beneficial, then we would also want to have some evidence for that as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I just feel like there are two sides to it, right? Because you can jump on the bandwagon, especially a lot of pros with Adderall.
Yeah.
Abuse is, hasn't said to improve
Mm.
or decrease performance, and yet, it's still being utilized. I definitely think, as an individual, you kind of want to just make sure what you're taking is right for you, and having some evidence behind it is crucial. But as we start to close out this podcast, is there any advice you would have for whether it's researching further about psychedelics, or advice you would have for getting into the industry as a performance coach? Is there anything you would give with your experience?
So in terms of the psychedelics, I would say that these are powerful mind-altering substances. That's something you should be aware of. It's not to be taken lightly. It should be done with medical advice. I'm not advocating for anyone at all to experiment or to do these controlled illegal substances in any jurisdiction. What I'm researching, what I'm interested in, is the experience of the people who already done it, and see how they feel. What is the evidence there? I'm not advocating for anyone to do that at all. And I'm not kind of telling people to do it. But yeah, so it's something that people maybe should consider. And one thing to note is that no psychedelics are considered a doping substance. They're not in any of the controlled doping substances.
Interesting.
So in terms of should it be banned? Should it be banned in competitions? Well, the regulating bodies, none of them, as far as I'm aware anyways, I might be wrong, but none of them consider psychedelics to be that kind of performance enhancing drug. They don't control it as a doping substance. So there's that. But in general, I would say it's something that you should be very careful about if you're interested in it, particularly because there is so little research into what it is.
Definitely.
And in terms of maybe some important things to consider if you are hoping to become a psychology practitioner, or if you're hoping to hire one, again, it is to go through that, to see what is the best path for you. And again, this differs from country to country and from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But I think ideally where we want to be is to be in a space where everyone who is a psychology practitioner in esports will have some sort of accredited training in providing psychological support. So whether that's as a sport and exercise psychologist, as a counseling psychologist, clinical psychologist. So I've seen people with these titles in this space. I know they exist. But I also see a lot of people who don't necessarily have those qualifications.
Right.
So you might want to look at, if you're interested, you might want to look at attaining some of those. And it's by no means easy.
Right.
So I've completed the stage 1 kind of master's level training in sports and exercise psychology, and that is accredited by the British Psychological Society and by the Health and Care Profession Council.
And that's what makes it worth it, though, no? Because, the difficulty of getting it in the first place,
precisely.
You are enabling so much trust onto a psychologist to look after your players or look after yourself that I think it's deserved.
Yeah,
so
ideally you would want someone who has gone through all that training, who's done all those years of training. So I'm currently working towards that fully chartered status and doing my kind of doctorate, the doctoral training. So that's kind of the stage 2 to become a fully chartered psychologist, a fully chartered sport and exercise psychologist. So, it's a long process, it's years of training. And even as a doctoral trainee, right, it's not like, oh, you're a trainee, you don't know what you're doing. It's kind of like a trainee doctor where, okay, they might be a trainee doctor, but they just went through, 7 years or whatever of med school. It's a lot of training that people go through. And if you're, and I guess it is a relatively new form of accreditation as well. It's only kind of come in the UK anyways in the past few decades. So if somebody who's been in the space for a long time, they might not have that accreditation. I think there are pathways for them to gain it through their experience. But, so that's another thing to be aware of, that, it's relatively new. So maybe not everyone would have it. But ideally, in the future, we want to get into a place where everyone has some sort of accredited status, whether it's kind of that stage 2 fully chartered status or any other kind of status as well. Because I guess when you're trying to decide between someone who is, I guess, calling themselves a performance psychologist or who has a great reputation, but they don't have these qualifications, and you're choosing between them and somebody who's maybe not necessarily have the same reputation, but that could be because they spent years and years training rather than trying to build up their reputation. So I think there's different things for you to consider, and that kind of getting qualified, getting accredited is the right route for you to show potential organizations that you might want to work with that I have undergone this accredited training. I am able to practice psychology in a safe and ethical way. But yeah, so that's what I would say, and that's something for organizations to look out for as well, to say, or is your training accredited by the BPS or by the HCPC? Kind of look beyond that surface level, that reputation based, that I think is the majority of how things operate at the moment. That we'll look at your track record, right? Like, you've worked with these teams and they all won. It's not necessarily because of that person. I'm not saying it's not because of them, but not necessarily that correlation. And I guess the reputation, it doesn't always mean that they're a good practitioner, whereas having that qualification is some assurance that they at least have had that training. So I think that's something that people who are interested in becoming a performance psychologist, a sport and exercise psychologist, or esports psychologist, or whatever you want to call yourself. Yeah. I think any kind of psychology professional would hopefully be working towards some kind of accredited status. And for people hiring them, that's definitely one thing to look at. I know a lot of organizations would be very limited in their resources. Yeah. And, obviously your priority should be getting in the best coach that you can. Yeah. It should be best. It should be getting the best players that you can. And sports psychology, it's important, but it's not as important as having a good player, right? Right, yeah. So I get what you mean. So I guess in some ways it is more of a luxury, but it does give you that competitive edge over somebody who maybe doesn't have that psychological support. So it is important to consider and to get in. And even if you have very limited resources, I think a great place for those orgs to get trained, safe, ethical practitioners is to look at trainees, right? So people undergoing doctoral training like myself, or even completing this stage 1. And a lot of trainees, they do work for free. They do pro bono work to gain experience towards their qualification, to get clinical hours towards the qualification, or to just even that reputation, to make a name for themselves, to kind of say, I've done this, I've done that, to put that onto their CV. Okay. And there's a lot of trainees out there, well, not a lot, but there's a fair number of trainees out there that will do pro bono work for organizations. Cool. So that is potentially something that, if you're an org, you're looking to hire some sort of psychology professional, you can potentially work with those trainees rather than maybe someone who will charge you lots of money and is not necessarily as well trained. Right. And again, just because they're trainees, it doesn't mean they don't know what they're doing. It doesn't mean they're not experienced. They have had to do a whole psychology degree. They've had to do masters probably. They're at least master's level. So, they've spent a lot of time in education. They've spent a lot of time and money and effort into getting where they are now. Okay. So they are qualified professionals. It's not like a trainee that you that has no experience whatsoever. That is completely new to
the insight. It's still there, and you still get the benefits.
They've spent a lot of years training to be to that point, and they're still undergoing training, accredited training. So that's a source, that's a resource, a potentially free resource that a lot of orgs can take advantage of. But what I will say is that if you can offer them paid work, even if it's just a little bit, then that's going to make them want to work with you more, because potentially, this is a low-cost way for a lot of organizations to get something that is valuable to them that would have been very expensive otherwise. So
interesting.
They can be in high demand.
Okay.
So whatever the best offer you can make for them is good, because even though they're trainees, they are experienced. They do have a lot of expertise and knowledge, and they do know what they're doing. So if you can offer them paid work, that would be, that would make them want to work with you more. But a lot of them are happy to do pro bono work as well.
So with that being said, I hope the viewers listening or watching at home have like a really good comprehensive view on, what you do, what you study, how they themselves can get into the industry and or work around it. And with that being said, if anyone has any more questions or more knowledge they would like to gain, where can they find you and your studies?
So my studies are still currently being published. So they're not out yet, but they're in that process. You can follow me on my LinkedIn, where I will post about stuff if I get published, or other stuff that I get up to, whether it's working with different organizations, different clients, different things like that. I think LinkedIn is generally one I post on more about kind of things I do professionally in terms of psychology. So you can follow me on there.
Kelvin Ing?
Yes,
on LinkedIn.
Kelvin Ing on LinkedIn.
Perfect.
And you can also look up my website, which is mental / I don't know what that one's called, but it's that one, and then mentalphi.com.
Perfect. And if you at all wanted to follow me, you can find me on Twitter, Insta, LinkedIn as well. Louis Skilton, Skilton L being a 1. And yeah, that has been the London Legion login. Kelvin Ing, thank you so much once again for joining us.
For having me. It's a pleasure.
Just to conclude everything off, we've got to do it as tradition. A quick selfie, just to conclude. So cheese.
Cheese.
Perfect. Thank you once again. And we will see you next time. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.